The story begins with a beautiful and innocent young girl named Jeanne, who was born into a poor family in France. Her mother was a single parent and worked as a cook in a wealthy household. Jeanne also lived in the same house with her mother. However, unlike other children her age, Jeanne had a different mindset. She dreamed of living a luxurious life like the rich, wearing elegant dresses like queens, socializing with influential people, and earning everyone's respect. But for a poor girl like her, this was nothing more than an unattainable dream. Jeanne wasn't just beautiful. She was also incredibly clever and sharp-witted. From a young age, she learned how to capture people's attention with her beauty and charming words. She had a deep love for reading and would often immerse herself in books. One day, her mother lost her job at the wealthy household, forcing them to move to Paris. There, her mother enrolled her in a convent school where nuns taught the children. However, Jeanne picked up a bad habit. She secretly started reading forbidden, inappropriate books. One day, while reading such a book, she was caught and subsequently expelled from the convent. After this, Jeanne had to find a way to earn money. She began working as a model for a painter, but when she was asked to pose nude for the paintings, she immediately quit. Later, she found employment in the house of a wealthy widow, where her job was to read books to the woman. The widow had 2 sons, and one day, she caught Jeanne in a compromising situation with one of them. Furious, the widow threw Jeanne out of her house. Years passed, and Jeanne slowly fell into bad company. She started associating with wealthy businessmen and aristocrats, using her beauty and sharp mind to attract them and establish connections. During this time, she met a wealthy man named Barry, who took her in as his mistress. Barry wasn't just attracted to Jeanne. He saw her as an opportunity to climb the social ladder. He believed that through Jeanne, he could gain access to the French royal court, hoping that the king would make Jeanne his mistress, which would in turn bring Barry closer to the monarchy. Barry had a son, and surprisingly, Jeanne cared for him as if he were her own child. However, Barry soon started pressuring Jeanne to meet the King of France. At that time, the king's wife and former mistress had both passed away, leaving him lonely and drowning in indulgence. He had 3 daughters who lived with him in the palace. Eventually, Barry took Jeanne to the royal palace, where many beautifully dressed women were already gathered, each hoping to become the king's new mistress. However, none of them caught the king's eye. But the moment he saw Jeanne, he was instantly captivated by her beauty. Compared to all the other women, Jeanne stood out, unique, mesmerizing, and extraordinary. When Barry brings Jeanne to his home, a minister from the king's court arrives and informs Jeanne that the king wishes to meet her. He also hands her some money. Hearing this, Barry becomes overjoyed and instructs Jeanne to please the king well. Jeanne then prepares herself and leaves with the minister. The minister takes Jeanne to the royal palace, which is grand and breathtakingly beautiful. Before meeting the king, a doctor examines Jeanne. Since she had been involved with multiple men in the past, they wanted to ensure she did not have any infections. After the examination, the doctor confirms that Jeanne is completely healthy. Following this, the king's minister asks Jeanne a few questions and instructs her on how to behave in the king's presence, what to do and what to avoid. Jeanne quickly grasps everything. Once she is ready, the minister sends her to meet the king. Although Jeanne was an ordinary girl, she was intelligent and extraordinarily beautiful. She carried herself with the grace and sophistication of royal women, which immediately captivated the king. As they begin conversing, they grow closer to each other. The next day, the king's minister visits Jeanne and takes her to a secret chamber from where she can observe the king's daily routine. Every morning, when the king gets ready, his daughters and other courtiers gather to watch him. Jeanne observes how the king prepares himself and how much respect he commands among his people. After the king finishes getting ready, he approaches Jeanne. She curiously asks him if his daily life always follows this routine. The king laughs and responds, "Yes." He then presents Jeanne with a luxurious and exquisite necklace, which fills her with joy. The king had developed a deep liking for Jeanne, and she too found happiness in his company. From that point on, the two began spending more time together in private. One day, while Jeanne was riding in a horse-drawn carriage with the king's minister, They stopped at a location where Jean used a telescope to observe the king. She noticed that he was with his grandson, a remarkably handsome young boy. She also saw the king's 3 daughters, but their behavior quickly revealed their unpleasant nature. They were mistreating their servants. One of the princesses suddenly caught sight of Jean sitting in the carriage and immediately informed her sisters. Realizing their father was having an affair with Jean, they grew furious. The minister, noticing that they had been spotted, hastily ordered the driver to speed up the carriage and leave the place at once. Later, when the king was alone, his 3 daughters confronted him. They angrily said, "We are still grieving our mother's death, yet you are indulging yourself with mistresses. This is unacceptable. The entire society will mock us." After they left, the king confided in his minister, saying that while he could no longer stay away from Jeanne, he had no intention of marrying her. Instead, he declared Jeanne as the First Lady, a title that, while not making her a queen, granted her all the privileges and luxuries of one. Following this announcement, Jeanne was given a grand and extravagant welcome into the royal palace. However, Jeanne was not welcomed with open arms by everyone in the palace. The king's daughters despised her, and the aristocratic women were outraged that a common girl had been given such a high status. They believed she had no place being so close to the king. Many people in the palace tried to belittle Jeanne and sought ways to drive her out. That night during dinner, the king gifted Jeanne an African child so she wouldn't feel lonely in the palace. Jeanne was overjoyed upon receiving him and soon began to treat him like her own son, spending time playing with him. Meanwhile, the king was deeply pleased with Jeanne, so he gifted her a magnificent palace, complete with numerous servants at her disposal. Jeanne was overjoyed by her new life, but deep down, she feared that one day the king might fall for another woman and abandon her. However, for now, the king was utterly devoted to Jeanne and found immense happiness in her presence. The following day, the king and Jeanne went on a picnic outside the palace, where Jeanne's mother and Barry were also present. Jeanne's mother was worried that as time passed and Jeanne's beauty faded, the king might leave her. She feared they would once again be plunged into poverty. She shared her concerns with Barry and Jeanne, but Jeanne reassured her mother that such a thing would never happen. At the picnic, Barry's son also arrived, and Jeanne spent time chatting with him. The next day, the African child met the king's daughters, but instead of welcoming him, they mocked his dark skin and hurled insults at him. Meanwhile, the king's youngest daughter was deeply unhappy with her father. She disapproved of his relationship with Jeanne and, in a fit of anger, decided to leave home and become a nun. The king loved his youngest daughter dearly, and her departure shattered him completely. In his loneliness and grief, he sought comfort in the arms of another woman. Jeanne soon learned of this betrayal. She immediately confronted the king's minister and furiously asked, "Did the king dare to sleep with another woman while I am still here?" The minister hesitated, but then admitted, "Yes, but this is the first time since you arrived. The king did it out of sorrow." He tried to assure Jeanne that she was still the king's most cherished love, but Jeanne was clear in her stance. She firmly told the minister, "If the king ever tires of me, you must inform me beforehand. I will leave on my own." The king, unwilling to lose Jeanne so easily, sought her out and rekindled their bond. Over time, their relationship deepened further. Jeanne had now spent 4 years with the king, and their connection had only grown stronger. Despite this, the king's daughters and many in the palace continued to resent her. However, Jeanne had learned how to deal with them and stand her ground. She invited Barry's son to the palace and introduced him to the king. She arranged for him to stay at the palace and receive training in swordsmanship and other skills. Meanwhile, preparations were underway for the wedding of the king's grandson. He was set to marry the daughter of Austria's ambassador, who was destined to become the new Queen of France after the wedding. The night the Austrian ambassador arrives at the palace, a grand feast is held. Jeanne, dressed elegantly alongside the king, stuns everyone with her presence. In front of all the guests, she boldly kisses the king, shocking the nobles, who immediately begin whispering insults about her. When the king's grandson's fiancée inquires about Jeanne, the king's daughters and the influential figures in the palace poison her mind against Jeanne. They tell her, "You are about to become the Queen of France, and to rule the palace without any interference, you must ensure Jean is removed from here." Now, the soon-to-be queen sees Jean as her enemy. One day, while Jean is at the church, the king's minister arrives with tragic news. Barry's son has died while practicing sword fighting. Jean rushes to see him and is devastated to find him lifeless. She breaks down in tears, mourning deeply for him as she had considered him her son. His death shatters her, leaving her in a state of grief. The king tries to comfort her, but the palace women and the king's daughters mock Jean's sorrow. She remains silent, refusing to respond to their taunts, and the king advises her to ignore them. Soon, Jean is set to meet the king's grandson's fiancée. But by then, the king's daughters have already turned her against Jean. When Jean approaches her, the woman coldly turns her face away, which greatly displeases the king. He tells Jean, "For the sake of maintaining good relations between France and Austria, you must befriend her." Following his advice, Jean speaks to the young woman. Since she too needs to secure her country's alliance, she agrees to converse with Jean. Overjoyed, Jean reports back to the king, exclaiming, "She spoke to me nicely." This makes the king happy as well. A few days later, the king falls seriously ill with smallpox and becomes bedridden. His health worsens rapidly, and he grows weaker by the day. During this difficult time, Jean dedicates herself to caring for him, ensuring he is looked after. However, as the king's condition declines, Jean's troubles in the palace intensify. She knows that if the king dies, she will be cast out. Fearing for Jean's safety, the king urges her to leave while she still can, to avoid the misfortunes that would befall her after his passing. But Jean refuses to abandon him in his condition. As time passes, the king realizes his death is near. He tells Jean, "You must leave now. People have never accepted our relationship, and after my death, they might kill you." Jean does not want to leave him in such a state, but she knows she has no choice. In an emotional farewell, they share one last moment together before she departs. The African child stays behind. Jean's departure brings joy to the king's daughters and many in the palace. A few days later, the king passes away, plunging the palace into mourning. His grandson is declared the new king of France. Meanwhile, Jean is left powerless and alone, abandoned by society. She is shunned and imprisoned in a convent for a year. Eventually, the new king orders her release, but forbids her from ever returning to the palace. Years later, the French Revolution erupts, bringing an end to the monarchy and ushering in a republic. The new king is arrested, convicted of treason, and sentenced to life imprisonment. Jean, accused of leading movements against the republic, is also tried and sentenced to death. Later, the imprisoned king dies in jail, marking the end of the royal lineage. And with this, the movie comes to an end. Friends, thank you for watching the video till the end. If you liked it, please like and share this video. For more movie explanations, subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so you don't miss upcoming videos. Until next time, bye-bye.